listening to the Labor Notes podcast, our weekly show on rank and file news and organizing tactics. I'm Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm Natasha Laney-Ullman, a staff writer at Labor Notes. On January 23rd, we saw workers in Minnesota come together for a day of action. It involved the kind of demonstrations and protests we've seen a lot of, especially in the Trump era, but this one also seemed to be an answer to escalating calls in the past year for a general strike.
Workers, religious leaders, and various groups had organized a day of, quote, no work, no school, no shopping, end quote. Many unions backed the call, including SEIU 26, Unite Here Local 17, the St. Paul Federation of Educators Local 28, and the Minneapolis Federation of Educators, that's AFT Local 59, the Transit Union, ATU Local 1005, the Minneapolis Regional Labor Federation, AFL-CIO, and several others.
Our coworkers, Luis and Diana, were there that weekend. They joined ICE Out civil disobedience action by clergy at the Minneapolis airport on that Friday morning. They were there at the march in downtown Minneapolis later that afternoon. Luis was also among the groups of press and workers on the scene the next morning on Saturday after ICE agents shot and killed Alex Preddy, an intensive care nurse at a Veterans Affairs hospital and a member of AFG Local 3669, which represents federal workers. And Diana and Luis were both at a vigil for Preddy that evening.
We'll talk about what they saw that weekend, what they heard from workers about what it's like to live under siege by ICE, and how workers are organizing a real resistance. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
We have a lot of questions for you both, but before we get into it, what is the most important thing you want people to know about what you saw on the ground and heard from workers that you think may not come across from just reading about it in the news?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that we must believe our eyes. Federal agents are going on a rampage to abduct immigrants and citizens, attacking people using their constitutional rights to protest and document the paramilitary-style activities of these federal agents. The deployment of federal agents to the Twin Cities stands at upwards of 3,000 compared to 250 last fall in Chicago. I believe the police force in Minneapolis is about 800 police officers compared to this invading army of 3,000. So it's a clear federal escalation. But just as they've escalated their assaults, so too have everyday people taking to the streets to defend their neighbors, co-workers, and families in the face of extreme violence, including the killings of 2 legal observers and immigrant workers in custody. People are risking their lives and limbs to stand up to a federal terror campaign seeking to cow them into silence and compliance.
I echo everything Luis said. Every single worker that we talked to, teachers, Uber drivers, call center workers, flight attendants, grad student workers, they all had a story about how the occupation has impacted their workplace, each more upsetting than the next. Citizen or not, each of these workers saw a clear and direct impact on their working conditions, on their coworkers, and on their own lives. The raids and abductions are not something that are just happening in the background. The actions by ICE in the Twin Cities have violently ruptured everyday life.
And maybe this is related, but it's becoming more common to see calls for a general strike on social media. What is the work and organizing that needs to happen for such strikes to actually have real mass participation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before we get to that, let's kind of set the scene in terms of what happened here, what the emerging story is, right? So the Twin Cities strike began in many ways in solidarity with immigrants, many of whom stayed home and didn't march because they were scared of being abducted by ICE. So unlike 2006, when there was a mass mobilization nationwide, and that was mainly driven by immigrant workers calling out and marching, this one was a little different. It's estimated that 75,000 to 100,000 people marched through downtown Minneapolis, and the conditions were ripe for this outpouring of activity from, various segments of civil society in Minnesota. So I like to say that the conditions were kind of ripe for this. So when we think about a general strike, there's certain ingredients that you need to have in order for that to occur. You need organization, and then you need a galvanizing event that, just thrusts people into mass action. And that's what happened here. Work stoppages were already underway as workers began calling out in the construction and service sector, where immigrant workers are largely employed. Trump had set, tinder and fire on Minnesota by dispatching, these federal agents, these thugs, to harass people, to racially profile people. They've literally arrested ICE agents off duty at the gas station because they were not in full uniform because they have to meet these quotas. So in many ways, you can say that these strikes kind of began silently by immigrant workers calling out from their jobs and refusing to report to work. So before anyone called for them, workers were already organizing from below to pressure their employers, either to not allow ICE to come into the business without a judicial warrant, or just by calling out or asking for time off because they didn't feel safe reporting to work. So unions and community groups provided the political organization, to kind of channel that mass outpouring of anger and frustration. So institution after institution came out in support, following an arc of escalation, like unions, faith leaders, and elected officials and small businesses. Even if these actions were part of a comms push to artificially generate momentum, they broke out of that mode and spread the strike far beyond what organizers might have imagined. That's why I call it a mass strike. A mass strike is a social earthquake. It reorders the tectonic plates beneath the existing hierarchies, and pillar after pillar of civil society begins to shake, finally freed of the old orthodoxy that had locked it firmly in place. So that's what we witnessed. That's why small business owners make temporary common cause with their workers. Faith leaders join the call for action, lending moral validity from the pulpit, and pressure from below ruptures, layer after layer of civil society, producing this upsurge that envelops the whole of civil society. So the timing was right. Plus, the organizations were already in place and ready for unified action after decades of coalition building.
Yeah, Labor Notes published a piece by Stephanie Luce last week called How to Spread the General Strike Beyond the Twin Cities. And I want to emphasize a point that she makes. She writes, quote, "A coalition won't hold if groups join only because it is the right thing to do. Its members have to see their material interests tied to the success of the alignment," unquote. I think this is so important. Take, for instance, the march on January 23rd. Minneapolis is a city with a lot of immigrant workers, but as Louise said, the people who showed up to the march were not necessarily immigrant workers. What we saw and what a teacher at the march confirmed was that the people who participated did so in every way that they could, and they made calculated decisions about their own safety and the safety of their families. So the folks who showed up may not have necessarily been those who are the most vulnerable to ICE. But the solidarity that we're seeing in the Twin Cities is deeper than people getting involved or calling out of work or showing up to a march because of a moral imperative. They're participating because what's happening is a threat to their very communities, to the fabric of their lives, and because their own interests are tied up with those of their immigrant neighbors, coworkers, friends, and family. This is one of the factors that makes what we're seeing so powerful, but also, frankly, difficult to replicate on a national scale. To me, it looks like the long and difficult work of coalition building in the Twin Cities is paying off now, and unfortunately, there's not a substitute for that.
We've heard this argument to leave politics out of shop floor conversations and focus on quote-unquote bread and butter workplace issues. You could always have argued that that's a blinkered way of looking at it, but it's not even an option right now for many workers who are forced to confront ICE in their workplaces. Luis, you've reported that letter carriers organized a rally in December to, quote, kick ICE agents off 2 postal parking lots in South Minneapolis, end quote. You quoted a bus driver saying his coworkers of East African, specifically Somali origin, are just walking around with their U.S. passports now because agents are getting onto buses and doing whatever they can to grab people. And you've reported that in response, ATU Metro Transit workers have asked ICE to back off. What can we learn from them and from the many teachers, nurses, hospitality, and other workers in Minnesota who've had no choice but to talk to their coworkers about immigration and ICE raids and organize a response? How is that kind of political education now becoming part of the shop floor?
Yeah, after the murder of Alex Preddy, I met up with a few organizers at a local Mexican restaurant. The TV was on, and the blaring sound of whistles filled the dining area. The cooks and waitstaff all came out with panic on their faces. ICE's campaign of terror is a workplace issue. No one is safe unless we are all safe from their impunity and violent thrill-seeking antics. So, As Kim Moody has written, there's always a tension between the union as an institution and the union as a movement. In moments of crisis like the one that we face today, leaders can become conservative and risk averse because they need to protect the institutions, which can mean avoiding strikes, staying within the letter of the law, and abiding by the contract. What I heard from union leaders in the Twin Cities was a recognition that they needed to be responsible stewards of the union, but they also needed to act with courage and conviction. I think their resolve was steeled by the fact that workers themselves were self-organizing and taking action. So one of the questions that I am contemplating is, can political strikes restore labor's power? Because that's what we witnessed. In many ways, it was a strike against federal policy, kicking ICE out of Minnesota and out of everywhere. So I think that opens up new conversations in the labor movement about what collective action looks like. Most union contracts obviously come with no strike clauses, and there are severe penalties for striking when the contract is in effect, but unions have found workarounds to meet the moment. The St. Paul teachers overwhelmed the substitute teacher system, pressuring the district to close down. Ultimately, it was the weather that dealt it the fatal blow, and schools were forced to close, but the teachers were organized and flexed their collective muscle. Workers marched on the boss, demanding that they close down for the day across music venues, restaurants, art institutions, and many employers heeded their workers' demands. The pressure has been building for some time, though, and coalitions have hardened into a stronger and more disciplined bloc. The teachers have signed up new members, app drivers have joined SEIU Local 26 in large numbers. ICE hasn't entirely chilled organizing, and that's very important to underscore. We often hear of stories in the national press that just flood the zone with Trump's murders. And I think it's important to not lose sight of, contrary to the dictum of most journalists, that if it bleeds, it leads, that we highlight the full spectrum of ingenuity, of courage, and the hardships that people are facing in Minnesota. So I think a combination of all of that is what has spurred people into mass action. New life has been breathed into the labor movement, and I think that's an important point to kind of pause on. When we think about the labor movement in moments of upsurge, it has always been pressure from the outside that has moved unions into a more aggressive, more radical posture. That happened in the 1930s, it happened in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, and I think we are witnessing something similar happening today. People are radicalized, they're ready to take action, and in Minnesota, they're the institutions. The institutions are there to help channel that, to help formalize that, to give it a durable structure, to exercise the kind of power that can wield leverage against the bosses and shut things down. So it is fair to say that there has been a rupture in the status quo, and the unfolding crisis has bound people together in a strategy of mutual defense and mass action. That's how an upsurge happens. And these were the elements in play in the Twin Cities. That's why the language of a mass strike is so fitting, even if the uprising's economic impact is still unclear. For example, the main corporations were not shut down, right? But the CEOs of 60 of them came out with a mealy-mouthed statement asking for de-escalation. The points of leverage are also hard to assess, right? This is not 1934 Minneapolis where Teamster truckers can kind of shut down the metropolitan area. We are talking about some of the lowest paid, the immigrant workforce of Minnesota were the ones that were under the gun here, right? So we're talking fast food workers, food service workers, restaurant workers, construction workers. These are the immigrant workers that Trump's administration is targeting. But the social edifice has been shaken to its foundation nonetheless, creating new openings, and a new self-confidence has seized the working class across various civic layers, not exclusively unions. That's why people are venturing outside of their homes, knowing that they may be killed. There is a real sense that they are willing to put it all on the line without fanfare, without exaltation from anyone. It's everyday people. It's the wine moms, it's the grannies from the suburbs, it's the immigrant workers from the Mexican taquerias. They are all united in standing up to this federal offensive.
Absolutely. Thanks, Luis. We've been talking about what other workers can learn from organizers in Minnesota, but are there things workers there learn from workers in other cities targeted by ICE? Luis, you've reported, for instance, about the Minneapolis Federation of Educators drawing lessons from the Chicago Teachers Union.
Yeah, no, absolutely. People are talking across unions, across geographies, trying to figure out like how do we knit together a national resistance movement that is rooted in the working class, a national resistance movement that's about workers over billionaires, that is clear in its class analysis about what the pillars propping up this authoritarian regime include, and it includes the bosses. And that's why there have been campaigns targeting Target and Home Depot and Enterprise and other key corporate players, because we need defections from the ruling regime if workers are going to force a breakthrough out of this authoritarian moment. So groups in Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland, they have all been talking, right? They have all been thinking through, like, what does it mean to keep our schools safe? They have shared resources around how do you build a solidarity schools, so that if one of our students or one of our staff is attacked, like what do you do in those instances? Like how do you create the infrastructure to support one another? So I think that is happening. There are boots on the ground from various unions, also learning from the experience in Minneapolis and taking that back home, because make no mistake, what's happening in Minneapolis is going to spread unless we stop Trump now. So that's kind of been the dynamic, right? There's a dynamic of crisis and opportunity. We are well aware of the crisis, but the opportunity seldom gets talked about, perhaps because it's giving something away to the enemy. But the enemy should know that just as they're treating Minneapolis as a laboratory for Trump's paramilitary forces to learn how to break other cities, we are also workshopping how to fight back. We are getting better at it. And part of what we've seen in Minneapolis is the density of these mutual aid networks, the fact that neighborhoods have pretty much all their neighbors like plugged into some chat to alert each other if they see ICE. So they are in a state of constant mobilization and they are ready. And that level of preparation needs to happen nationwide.
Coming back to the day of action, how did unions help embolden members to participate? I know there was a call for employers not to retaliate against workers taking the day off.
Yeah, my understanding is that there was quite a bit of concerted pressure put on employers to not retaliate against workers who took the day off to participate in the mass action. And it's a little bit hard to assess how successful that campaign was, since a lot of local businesses that closed may have done so because of the extreme cold or most likely because of fear. ICE's presence has had a truly chilling effect on the local economy, which is something we heard over and over again from workers and also saw. But one story that we heard was about CWA Local 7250, whose president, Kieran Knutson, spoke at the rally that followed the January 23rd march. CWA has had 2 members abducted by ICE at their workplace in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Local 7250 put significant pressure on AT&T, one of the major employers of its members, and it got it to agree not to penalize any workers who called out without pay. The members that I spoke to estimated that 80% of their 700 worker local missed work on January 23rd. To quote Lori Wolf, a Local 7250 member and call center worker, she's tired of being on the wrong side of history. This is, of course, not true across the board. Many workers had no such assurance that they wouldn't be retaliated against, but this was one bright spot.
We've had a lot of debate in the labor movement this past year, especially about tactics that workers and unions really need to be trying right now. We featured some of them on our own roundtable series of articles by contributors in the labor movement. Listeners can find those at labornotes.org/roundtable. So, what tactics are organized union members trying in Minneapolis right now that you think have been effective? And what does it even mean to be effective? How do workers know when something has worked or made a difference when the government response is chaos and escalation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few metrics to kind of evaluate success, right? One of them is, does it build worker leadership? Does it build our capacity? Does it neutralize our enemy? So right now, our enemy has not been neutralized. The attacks continue. Just today in Minneapolis, there was a recording that was making the rounds on social media about a group of ICE agents pulling over someone, a legal observer with guns drawn while they were trying to document, their activity in a neighborhood. So I think that we're only at the beginning of this struggle. But what I think people are learning is that in order to force some defections from the ruling clique that supports and props up Trump, you need to force defections. And no amount of moral suasion is going to move these big capitalists. What is going to move them is the organized power of workers to shut things down. So what I think we saw in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities more broadly was a structure test demonstrating what an economic disruption could look like. So the next arc of escalation includes No King's Day on March 28th, and then there's May Day. So we have been on a trajectory of protests, mass mobilizations like No Kings. What we have not experimented with yet is economic disruption. So the story of economic disruption in Minneapolis on January 23rd is incomplete because even though the city shut down, many of the large businesses were not impacted. So the No Kings March on the 28th is another potential escalation. What would be interesting is that in the past, these marches have been on the weekend. So this one is no different. It's on a Saturday. Imagine if instead of a Saturday, 3 million people were to flood a downtown and force the shutdown because the buses cannot get through. The big bankers in downtowns across the country cannot get to their offices because this swarm of humanity is blocking their way. I think for No Kings, they need to take a page from what the labor movement is experimenting with and try to do more economic disruption because they've already demonstrated that they can turn out 3 million people. So to answer your question, I think what we are seeing is more experimentation with economic disruption, more experimentation with targeting the bosses that are the key linchpin that's propping up this authoritarian regime.
I agree that it's really hard to measure success and that there's not really great metrics for knowing when things are working. But one perspective that was shared with us by a local organizer was that the rapid response work that Minneapolis residents and St. Paul residents have been engaging in is making it really hard for ICE to stage large raids. So because the residents are so effective at getting people on the scene quickly, you can get 25, 30 people to show up within just a couple of minutes. ICE has to rely more on these quick smash and grab abductions, which means that they are just not able to, I'm assuming they're not able to detain as many people at once in a single go. I also do think that the landscape has changed rapidly. I mean, anybody who's sort of following the legal landscape of what, know your rights looks like, what it looks, what rights people are entitled to, citizen or non-citizen, and how that has changed over the last several months to a year, can tell you that this has just deteriorated rapidly. I do think that that's also a response to successful tactics deployed by, community organizers, by immigrant rights groups who have done things like know your rights trainings. So it's hard to assess the ways that success, has various effects, but I don't think we should discount that that some of these tactics have forced ICE to reframe, to to try something different.
Yeah, thinking about this conversation about tactics and targets, one strategy we've seen more of over the past year is focusing on hotels that accommodate ICE agents coming in from out of town. There's sometimes a question about these tactics in the liberal press, which tends to portray its targets as themselves being immigrant hotel owners who are merely franchisees of big chains like Marriott and Hilton. Can you talk a bit about the value in assessing these types of specific targets, and how do these actions bring people together and build our capacity for disruption?
Yeah, I think, to echo some of what Diana just said, I think what these disruptions at hotels mean is that it prevents ICE from carrying out its abductions effectively, right? It wears them out because if they can't sleep, they're not going to be effective, on the road. So I think that that's one dimension of it. Another dimension of it is that many of the workers in these hotels are union members. Many of them are represented by Unite Here Local 17, which between SEIU, Local 26, and Unite Here, they've had since December 2025, they've had about 36 members abducted by ICE. So as we've said previously, this is not like something that's abstract or the people are doing because it's the right thing to do. This is deeply felt because these are people that they know. These are people that have names and addresses, loved ones that care for them. So that's why the emotion behind what's powering the momentum of this upsurge is so potent. It's because it's very real what's happening. So I think that that's part of the rationale behind picking hotels is to throw up some challenges to ICE's ability to do its repressive work. And I think that they have even gone on the news. The Border Patrol commander, Greg Balbino, who has been replaced by Tom Homan, went on the news to complain about how effective the resistance is in Minnesota. So I think that this kind of shows the maturity of the movement in terms of the tactics that they're using, where they are being very precise. Because this is the Labor Notes podcast and people get scoops on it that otherwise they wouldn't find in the print edition of the magazine or on the web. One anecdote to add here is that as we were gearing up, Diana and I, to go to the Twin Cities to report on the ground for Labor Notes and bear witness to this federal occupation, unions and community groups were trying to figure out a way for journalists to cover the event because the conditions were frigid and there was concern about people getting frostbite. And this was before they had settled on an indoor rally at the Target Center. And one of the snags was finding a hotel that didn't have ICE agents. So in terms of this occupation, when we say that you can't go anywhere in the Twin Cities and not run into an ICE agent or Border Patrol agent, that's what we mean. Like, the society is completely saturated with resistance and repression. So ultimately, it was unnecessary to kind of find this hotel, but it was something that people had to navigate in order to ensure, safety and security for people coming out of town to cover this mass protest. That, for instance, a person like me that is rich in melanin but poor in dollars is like a prime suspect for being nabbed by ICE. So I had a fellow journalist, pick me up at the airport, right? So even the job of reporting becomes very difficult in these conditions. It is almost as though we were reporting from a war zone as opposed to reporting from an American city.
This might be hard to talk about because you were both there, but we should acknowledge the violence in Minneapolis that weekend and in the weeks leading up to it. Here's an excerpt from a piece you wrote, Luis, for Labor Notes on January 16th. Quote, "Festering grievances swelled into a national outcry on January 7th after ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed poet and mother of three, Renee Nicole Good, in Minneapolis, while she and her wife were observing federal agents swarming her neighborhood. A week later, another federal agent shot a Latino immigrant from Venezuela in the leg. ICE agents have sprayed chemical agents in protesters' eyes. On Wednesday night, they detonated a tear gas canister underneath the car of a family just trying to get home from basketball practice. The baby strapped in his car seat was knocked unconscious. Trump's regime has ramped up racist attacks targeting Somali, Latino, and Asian communities, battering down doors, raiding small businesses, and forcing them to shutter, trailing school buses, dropping tear gas outside schools, circling hospitals, end quote. For listeners, the piece is titled, Will ICE Ignite a Mass Strike in Minnesota? You can read it on labornotes.org. It feels cliche at this point to state that American public life is steeped in violence, but in this especially volatile moment, it's hard not to step back and realize that we're being asked to simply accept serious danger in daily public life. Luis, you were in the crowd with Minnesotans on the morning of January 24th when Alex Preddy was killed by ICE agents and saw the aftermath as federal agents unleashed tear gas, rubber bullets, and flashbang grenades at civilians. I'm still processing these events even from afar. How did people help each other when they got hit? What does it mean to be gassed? What are people up against right now when they go out to protest? And how should workers prepare for when we plan for bolder escalations for economic disruption, if not an all-out general strike?
Yeah, I think in terms of planning for the general strike, people should go to strikeready.org to get information on how they can train up, to come together with their coworkers and think about what a national day of action will look like for May Day. So that's the first order of business is strikeready.org. Also go to the Labor Notes webpage and find our Fight Back School guide so that you can, come together with a group of your coworkers and think about what kind of collective actions you can take. So it starts with having conversations with your coworkers, making an assessment of what power you possess and how you can move the powerful bosses in your life, to do the right thing. And in this case, is to stop collaborating with the Trump regime. So in terms of the other questions, I'd like Diana to chime in as well around the mutual aid networks, because that's a critical component here. So what I'll say briefly is that it felt like I was in a war zone when I was there. I had my press badge over my neck, and I joked with a friend that I was wielding it the way that a Catholic might wield a crucifix to ward off evil. It didn't work, as I was in the crowd and they fired flashbang grenades, and then you saw a plume of smoke just envelop the crowd, and people, myself included, were just gasping for air. I continued to record because they went after a person and tackled him to the floor. And we were concerned just after Alex Preddy, are we going to witness another murder? And I don't know if the camera itself would have prevented that. They clearly are flexing their authoritarian, abuse of power by tackling and roughing up civilians that are unarmed. So I don't think the camera necessarily stops them, but it is important for us to, like you said, Danielle, it's important to put this in the context of the George Floyd uprising, and even before that, Philando Castillo, and so many other murders by police in this country. So it's not like this is like we were living in an idyll of innocence and then all of a sudden Trump comes into power and everything is horrible. No, things have been escalated. There's been some erosion of what is permissible, including just blatant lies. The fact that, Alex Preddy was characterized as being a terrorist, even though he was a union nurse who cared for, our veterans. That just indicates how, quite frankly, fascistic this moment that we're living in is. So I think my big takeaway around economic disruption and de-escalations is that these defense networks, have been building up capacity to keep people safe to the extent that is possible. But there are risks involved, and people are making calculated risks to go out there. But they're at the point where they're willing to put it all on the line. Everyone that was there on Nicollet Avenue knew that they ran the risk of getting shot, of getting arrested, and they still showed up for their neighbors because it has to stop.
Thank you so much, Luis. We've linked the websites Luis mentioned in our episode description. Diana, I know something you've been thinking about is how there's an important story of mutual aid and worker organizing and community response that's maybe getting a little bit lost in the alarm about ICE terror. What did you see in Minneapolis that you think people watching from afar should know about?
First of all, I think that the degree of personal risk that workers, students, and retirees are taking on to make this happen deserves acknowledgement. And I think Luis just did a really great job saying as much. But first of all, not everyone had a guarantee that their boss wouldn't retaliate if they participated in the action on January 23rd. For example, the University of Minnesota sent out emails ahead of time telling workers, faculty, staff, and grad workers that unexcused absences on the 23rd were subject to disciplinary activity. And then, of course, there's the sheer amount of force that federal agents are using, which can't be overstated. ICE, as we've seen, has no qualms about arresting, tear gassing, or even executing observers. And yet people are taking a huge amount of risk to track federal vehicles, to tail ICE agents on their way to raid workplaces and homes. And they're making it really difficult for them to stage large operations. I mean, these are just regular people. They don't have special training or equipment. They're literally wearing 3 layers of socks for warmth and ski goggles to protect from tear gas. The advantage that they have over ICE is relational. It's a knowledge of their city, of their neighbors, of their coworkers, of its institutions and community groups. Some of them have been through this before in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. They know how to survive in 20 below zero weather. So, seeing it for even just a few days was a reminder to me that power is never absolute. And I have a hopeful note for us to end on. There are just so many different ways that people are being drawn into this resistance work. There are neighborhood signal chats, which make it so that residents who can are able to show up if ICE is spotted near them. There have been dozens of Know Your Rights and legal observer trainings. Small businesses are covered in posters designating private property where ICE is not welcome. Volunteers are patrolling school pickup and drop off, distributing groceries to vulnerable households, collecting, cleaning, and returning laundry. Neighbors watch kids while others are out providing medical care to tear gas protesters. Pet rescuers are caring for pets that are left behind by community members who have been disappeared. Coworkers share rides to work. Unions host sign-making events. Artists sell their work to benefit legal defense funds and mutual aid funds. Every single protest, vigil, and rally is dotted with people who are passing out Somali tea or Palestinian lentil soup to keep people warm. Churches advertise warming stations and free counseling. I had countless people who could tell that I was unaccustomed to the cold give me the hand warmers from out of their own mittens. And I do think that this piece gets lost in the reporting because the terror of ICE overshadows these daily acts of solidarity. This kind of mutual aid obviously isn't going to end the occupation of the Twin Cities, but I can tell you for sure that there would have been no mass strike without it.
Thanks so much, Diana, for that reminder that at the center of organizing are people who care about each other. And thank you both so much for being there during this critical phase of organizing and reporting back. That's our episode. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, please download our episode.
Coming up next, we have our February Stewards Workshop on Thinking Like an Organizer on Wednesday, February 18th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Our Stewards Workshop after that in March will be on the topic of investigating grievances on Monday, March 16th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Our next Secrets of a Successful Organizer series will also be in March and on Wednesdays, March 4th, 11th, and 18th. Our next session on what to do when your union breaks your heart will be on Tuesday, March 17th.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Natasha Elena Ullman, Cindy Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.